Shall we start? Okay. Well, I'm delighted to welcome everyone to today's roundtable, which is being organized jointly with the Afghan Institute for Strategic Studies and the London School of Economics. For those who don't know me, my name is Marika Farrows, and I've been working in and on Afghanistan since 2007, much of it with policy. I'm very pleased to have everyone here today for this important discussion that is really aimed at unpacking the Taliban's online strategies and deepening our understanding of the movement itself. Since the fall of the Republic and the Taliban takeover, Afghans and internationals continue to wrestle to make sense of the causes of the collapse. A lot of the narrative is focused on the weakness of the Afghan government and on where to apportion the blame. Relatively less is said about the Taliban movement and their strengths. This event today is an attempt to explore one aspect of that side of the story, namely the Taliban's exploitation of emerging communication technologies. Secondly, as the Taliban shifts from an insurgent to a de facto ruler, understanding the implications for its online strategy and the potential openings and opportunities for a variety of stakeholders to respond to is important. But before we start, I'm going to say a few quick words about our Afghanistan Research Network program at the London School of Economics, which I lead with my colleagues Sahar Halamzai and Sam Vinson, our academic advisor. The program is part of a broader program, comparative program called PEACEREP, which is led by the University of Edinburgh. And the real purpose is to gain a better understanding of processes of political fragmentation and conflict amidst a shifting geopolitical environment, and to really build the evidence base to support the reimagining of transitions, peace, and development. Geographically, it includes researchers and teams working and who are from Myanmar, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, Syria, Ukraine, Yemen, and now also Afghanistan. Central to our work is addressing the real challenge in understanding and researching such contexts. For the collapse of the Afghan Republic, what became increasingly clear was the failure of evidence-based policymaking, the decentering of Afghan expertise in shaping policy in and on Afghanistan. Unfortunately, this has become even more acute of an issue both inside the country and now with many of those in exile. So our program is really a modest attempt to respond to this situation. Broad aims of our Afghan Research Network is threefold. First, to capture learning from the last 20 years. Second, to build on and strengthen existing Afghan expertise so that we can inform more effective policies. The purpose really is to build the evidence base and the research-based body of work that can respond to the complex challenges facing the Afghan people, and one that is in the interests of the Afghan people. And lastly, to begin building bridges to address the fragmentation of many now who find themselves in exile by collaborating on a common research agenda. Although we're still in the early stages of building this network, we're really excited about the research that is being generated. And we are looking forward to publications and further events going forward. We also see a number of other initiatives being undertaken both in the UK and around the world. Events like this one this afternoon are really an attempt to build those connections across this emerging research and advocacy landscape. Before I turn it over, I want to just say a couple of housekeeping issues. First is that the event is being live streamed, so if anyone has any issues with the photographs or being live streamed, just please let us know, and we will ensure that you will not be included. Secondly, we will be having one issue that the men's bathroom is not working, so you'll have to be going upstairs while the female restrooms are here. But moving forward, today's event is structured as follows. We begin with the first panel, where the speakers will really help us deepen this understanding of Taliban online strategies before and after the initial military. Then we'll have a short coffee break where we'll have some snacks available. This should happen around 3:40, and then our next panel will start at 4:10 p.m. Without further ado, though, I'd like to welcome Lynn O'Donnell, who will be moderating the first panel. She's a columnist at Foreign Policy, an Australian journalist and author. She's also the Afghanistan bureau chief for Agence France Press and the Associated Press between 2009 and 2017. Lynn, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Marika, and hi, everybody. Thanks for coming online and in the room. I think that what we're going to discuss today is an extremely important topic. I recall that when I was a correspondent based in Kabul that working for the news agencies, what we were basically doing was competing on time, second by second. How much faster am I than the competition? And so the faster we received the news, the faster we could get the news out. But as it turned out, the Taliban were much faster than anybody. Do you remember that? And I used to remonstrate with NATO and with ISAF and with then Resolute Support and the UN on how fast they could get the news. We're investigating. It would always take days. And meanwhile, the Taliban had told us how many helicopters they'd shot out of the air and how many soldiers how many tens of soldiers they had killed of the coalition, and how bad the coalition were treating the local population. And I really think that from the very early stages, the coalition effort was way behind the eight ball when it came to information dissemination, because even though we knew the Taliban were liars and we couldn't take what they said at face value, they got it out there first, so they got the first hits. And it seems to me that that's pretty much what they're doing now. They've learned, they've had a lot of advice, a lot of good advice from foreigners who I think vested interest, people who wanted to, put a little bit of peace in their pocket, say I was part of history. And I think what we have to look at now is how, since they took over, their strategy has changed. We've got a pretty... Oh, well, I've got here in my notes the note that we'd be deluding ourselves if we believe that the pronouncements of some of the vested interests that media organisations and journalists in Afghanistan, especially the domestic organisations, are able to do their work unimpeded, as one Rupert Murdoch wannabe said not so long ago. I think that is dangerous narrative as well, and we're here to discuss the narratives. And we've got a pretty distinguished panel, I think. We have Bilal Sawari, who is on screen. Hi, Bilal. Thank you for joining us. I think it's 9 o'clock in the morning in Toronto, so you didn't have to get up that early. We all had to slog through London. Yes, I was motivated to get up for this. I'm very glad that you did. Bilal is an international broadcast journalist. He's now living in Canada. His specialisation has been the linkages between warfare, drugs and terrorism. His MA thesis was titled The Farcification. I think we have to be very careful about how we say that. The Farcification of the Taliban, comparing insurgencies of Colombia and Afghanistan. I think very relevant, and during my time in Afghanistan, an aspect of the insurgency that was overlooked. Zia Sharia is a journalist with the BBC's Persian language service. He's here in London, obviously. Thanks for joining us, Zia. Previously, he was with Tolo TV and the BBC's World Service, and he made a documentary called Killing Hope, which focuses on the targeted killings. And we saw a lot of those in the months before the Taliban's takeover of the Republic, of journalists, human rights activists, politicians, civil society activists. And it won a prestigious AIB award. I'm not sure what AIB stands for. Can you tell us?
This is the AIB award is a UK-based award for the prestigious documentary production, mostly, and the documentary that we won was because of the very particular outreach and production during the COVID-19 time. That it was like a distance production that we did.
Well done. Well, congratulations on that. It's really good to have you here. Zia's going to talk to us about narratives in the 3 stages of narratives during the Taliban's last time in power, during the 1990s and since the takeover. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Solem Ibrahimi, here, thank you. Very welcome to you. This is the first day that we have met. He's a former senior official in the Republic, and he's served in refugee assistance, returnee reintegration, emergency humanitarian response operations, rural development and education project management, and security sector analysis, planning and policy with the UN and with the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, as was. His research interests are focused on security, strategy and international relations. Welcome, Solem. And as Marika told you, my name's Lynn O'Donnell. I worked in Afghanistan for very many years. I was there in 2001 when the Americans knocked the Taliban out, and I was there in 2021 when the Taliban knocked the Americans out. That's a fairly broad spectrum. I spent 4 or 5 months on the ground covering the last months of the war with my friend and colleague, Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer Masood Hosseini, and we were completely coincidentally on what was probably the last, at least one of the last commercial flights to leave Kabul before the Taliban came in. I went back last year. I wanted to report on 1 year of the Taliban in Afghanistan. I found out what had happened, what they were like. They really showed me their face. I was detained. I was interrogated. My life was threatened. I was forced to make false confessions, and after I'd left the country, I was accused of being a spy, which I believe gave the Taliban carte blanche to accuse anybody I had come in contact with of being a spy also. Very dangerous situation, and I haven't been back. So I'm going to invite our panellists to talk. Bilal's going to go first. I want each of you to give us about 7 minutes. Tell us what your thesis is, and then we'll take each of you in turn, and then we'll open it up for questions both online and in the room. Bilal, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. I mean, the way I see it is the Taliban leadership and the Taliban commanders and important figures continue to invest in their public images, public imaging when it comes to social media. So if you go to the Twitter profiles of Mullahs, the defense minister, the interior minister, and a bunch of these Taliban leaders, you will see that there's a striking similarity between Taliban officials and Republic officials who are too busy basically just trying to project themselves as sort of the saviors or the heroes in Afghanistan, while the country, had severe problems. Back then, obviously, it was the insurgency, it was security issues, of which the Taliban were a major part. Today, Afghanistan has many different crises. The economic one is one. The international isolation is another one. The fact that Afghans cannot afford a loaf of bread. The fact that you have death squads of Taliban torturing former AISS members, and so on and so forth. So it's very important to basically understand that aspect. In Afghanistan, unlike probably the rest of the world, perception is always built on consistency and not evidence. And I think that is something that the Taliban, among many other actors, understood really well, from the get-go. Interestingly enough, Len, the Taliban are forcefully and jealously sort of guarding their own narrative. What is that narrative? That narrative is that we have defeated the Americans, the Afghans working with them were puppets, and that Afghanistan is an island of perfection. And they are not allowing anyone else, basically, whether it's an internationally acclaimed reporter like yourself, a good friend of the country who have been with us for 20 years or more than that, or it is just an ordinary Afghan who is, expressing himself on Facebook or Twitter. We know what is happening. And in that sense, the Taliban have been continuously also warning our colleagues in the South that if you say that we are the interim government, or if you don't name Sheikh Ayatollah Khonzada with so many of his titles, then we will have trouble. And they have been killing a lot of these people. So it is important to know that the Taliban's crackdown has been there against the Afghan media, later on against our international colleagues. And what they are putting out basically on social media, is very clear, the content. I think, I would like to basically divide the Taliban into many different groups. Here, very quickly, if I can. Obviously, the number one was the political group, which was out They got even help from certain Western, individuals. The second group was always the commanders, the rigid ones, the hard-blooded ones, the ones who had been fighting alongside Al-Qaeda. And the third group were, like the foot-level soldiers, the guys who had lost family members in the war. They came from rural Afghanistan. And the fourth one led were the digital Taliban, the Talibs who, came mostly from the West, the Afghans who have UK passports, American passports, even where I am, Canadian passports, and we know them. And the digital Talibs, the number 4 group, is the most sort of aggressive one, they've been ganging up against anyone who basically challenged the Taliban on any basically simple issue. It is also interesting, as my last point, to notice how the Taliban literally managed to hide what I would think was possibly a state of emergency when Haibatullah Khunzada tried to sort of forcefully remove or demote Mullah and President Haqqani by bringing a number of old school brutal Taliban commanders like Mullah Fazl and Mayals into key security situations in Kabul, which I believe contributed to the Saudis saying that they were leaving, and Emiratis finally did it, and many others I think will follow. At least that was the perception created that, okay, these guys could have an internal combustion, various Taliban could have problems on the streets of Kabul, and needless to say that Haibatullah sent these 3 guys with a relatively big force from the south, from Kandahar. So I wanted to end there, Len. I apologize to you and to the distinguished panel and guests if I sort of deviated away from what you expected me to talk, but I would be sort of happy to come back and answer any questions that you have, and I hope that I stayed within those 7 minutes that you had allocated for me. Thank you.
Bilal, I've been timing you. You've still got 2 minutes to go, so I'll ask you a question. You mentioned the digital, we're here to talk about digital mullahs, and you mentioned the digital Taliban as being the most aggressive. There is a bot army. I've noticed that when I have put something, written something contentious, put it online, tweeted, I get attacked very, very aggressively, as you say, by a bot army. I used to call Tuesday Troll Day because suddenly there would be, a couple of hundred more people following me with 1 follower each. Can you talk a little bit about that that troll army, the aggressiveness, where it comes from? You mentioned the foreign passport holders. Who are they beholden to, and where are they?
Well, to be honest with you, they are in UK where you are. They're in Holland. They're in Norway. They're in Canada, and they are not hiding their love for the Taliban and their support. And interestingly enough, there are a number of female Afghans, who have a different lifestyle in the West, but they are supporting the Taliban sort of, full-scale Talibanization of Afghanistan. That's what I basically literally call it, and I also call it full-scale brutalization of Afghanistan. And we see evidence on that, right? But Len, I also want to make a comparison here. Under the Republic, there were these people, who came with Western passports, who, in my view, were coming for political tourism. Not all of them, but I think most of them. And there was a gang back then. I apologize, I have to use the word gang, but they were ganging up against people if you didn't agree back then with the Republic's sort of wicked policies. So the irony is that the Taliban in the previous Republic has many different similarities when it comes to these groups, right? And what was the job of these guys, that Afghans famously named them Tommies? I don't know what Tommy in the West means, but for Afghans, these were people who did not understand the languages, they could not connect to the local ground realities, and the same is happening with the digital Talibs. They are coming, they are based out of Kabul, they speak good English, they understand, and they tried And now some of them are upset because Afghans are putting a lot of pressure on them, saying, look, the Taliban are not nice and kind to the Afghan women. They are like cracking down against the Afghan people, right? So we see that group is very visible. It is, in some ways, I think Federal has failed, and you sort of to hold them accountable, because they are publicly threatening people, disrespecting people. And on that note, there's also a problem in the diaspora. There's also a problem with Afghans who are living outside, because what I call this whole situation in the social media landscape is cyber tribalism. We have lost the ability to engage in a constructive conversation. Everyone simply gangs up against you the moment you say something. And I think the bigger picture here is that it is not that all Afghans are Talibs. It's not that all Afghans are, the Republic side. It's not that all Afghans are members of the Daesh. This is about 40 million plus people who are living in a country that is resembling a prison, who are living in a country that, in my view, resembles North Korea in many ways, and we are going towards that path, eventually down the line. We're living in a country, unfortunately, where Kandahar and Kabul, cities under the Taliban, have become the crime and murder capitals in Afghanistan. 13 Afghan traders were kidnapped in 1 month in Kabul city, and the head of the Afghan Chambers of Commerce spoke to Tulu News. And the next thing I noticed, that story was brought down, right? There's a lot of pressure. So I hope that answered your question, Lynn. Thank you.
Thanks, Bilal. We'll come back to you when we open up for questions. Now I'm going to turn to you, Zia. You're going to talk to us about basically the historical narrative of the Taliban over 3 different incarnations. Please.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you, Dr. Baradian. Thank you, Marika, and the Afghanistan Institute of Strategic Studies, as well as the Conflict and Civicness Research group for holding this discussion. So I would start my discussion with the argument that the Taliban, since its emergence in 1994, has placed narrative creation at the heart of its struggle, and they've been very aware of the importance of narrative and the importance of the narrative in war and competition, and throughout their 3 decades since they existed. I can remember I was a child, possibly in 1994, when they emerged in Kandahar, and so their narrative was that they just emerged in the chaos of amid the chaos of the civil war, and they were the narrative was that they wanted to fight the corruption, they wanted to fight the evilness, shar and fasad in Farsi they would call it, but also to bring order to the country, and also to bring security, particularly, and most importantly, the establishment of Sharia law, the most important element of their narrative. But also these narratives very soon became dominant in Afghanistan, and I think in a matter of 2 years they were in the in the doors of Kabul, and just marched into Kabul without a lot of resistance from the government, because that government was also led by Mujahideen who had fought the Soviet Union's invasion in Afghanistan, but they just got into a really destructive civil war in the country. So eventually, this was the Taliban's narrative which dominated the country, and they were able to take power with the domination of their narrative. So during the first period of the reign of the Taliban, which is also called version 1 Taliban, their narrative and story remained very much consistent. They were the religious madrasa-based madrasa students who were there to fight corruption in Afghanistan, and they were originated from the 7 South Pashtun provinces, an ethnic group which is very much which has been in power in Afghanistan for a long time, which has dominated the polity in Afghanistan for 300 years, and so that was what they were. Their narrative was. They were thinking that they were saying that they will bring order, security to the country, and they were controlling the unity of the country. They were bringing unity, in territorial integrity to the country, and again, obviously, the Sharia law. These were some of the very important phenomena that the people of Afghanistan at that moment, I think, wanted to witness in Afghanistan. And using this narrative, they were able to capture almost 95% of Afghanistan and imposing a very medieval and draconian rule. So this was their narrative in their first period of power. But when it comes to the post 9/11, when the Taliban regime was collapsed as a result of the international intervention in Afghanistan, they were, when they re-emerged, their narrative had obviously changed. So that was, they couldn't have the same narrative, I think, and they emerged as freedom fighters, and they started and they had launched a jihad against Christian Western invaders who wanted to destroy the religious, cultural, and social values of Afghanistan. So the interesting thing was that in this era, the narrative was very much based on themes already built by the Soviet Union occupation of Afghanistan, because when the Soviets were in Afghanistan, the Mujahideen pretty much used the same themes of narratives. They were so the Taliban information operations aimed at mobilizing popular support in the country to motivate the Afghan population, and as well as the recruiting fighters were based on these narratives. So their information operation aimed at jihad to defend Islam both in Afghanistan and even beyond Afghanistan. The call to emulate past Afghan defeats of foreign invaders with special accent on ethnic Pashtun historiography, as well as tradition, value, and mythology. And a government, a corrupt government, they were talking, that was one of the themes, that the sponsorship of a corrupt government in Kabul, a puppet corrupt government, which the Westerners are providing all sorts of assistance, but they're corrupt and they're misusing all the means. And the warnings to Afghans working with the foreigners to stop supporting the foreigners, otherwise you will be facing the implications for that. So pretty much during this second period of the Taliban, when the international community, or should I say the Western forces, were in Afghanistan, their narrative was built around these Western night raids and also victimization of rural Afghans, dishonoring Afghan women and Afghan families, particularly in the south and in the Pashtun areas, as well as also other rural areas of the country. And this also, I think, happened at the time that there was a lot of technological changes in Afghanistan. The infrastructure for internet, for mobile, for digital and website and online activities started, and the Taliban did not miss the chance to use these technologies to spread their messages, their narrative, and they were very much active throughout all different social media as well as the using the website, but also all sorts of traditional messaging mechanisms, including, I mean, the shabnamas or the night letters are very, very famous, that they were using from the very early days of resistance, should I say resistance, or fighting against the foreign troops in Afghanistan. And their taranas, the songs that they have, very famous songs, well loved in southern Afghanistan, in southern villages, mostly in Pashto language, but also in Farsi, in Dari. And also they used the traditional media. They were very much in contact with the journalists, including ourselves, which I was working yourself, I'm pretty sure. They were using, or should I say sometimes misusing, the journalists, the environment of the freedom of media in the country. And they were very quick to respond. Obviously, they did not have, we say, the editorial, checks and balances. The thing was that, so just propaganda and be ready online and respond to all the situation at every event. And so, yeah, they were using these all sorts of online and digital mechanisms to disseminate their message to different parts of Afghanistan. And it's a sort of well-known fact that they were much quicker than the international forces in Afghanistan, than the government of Afghanistan. And they were very much responsive to the media as well. We contacted them. So this is kind of the second stage that they were, and also their narrative was directed to the international community, directed to the Afghan audience, and understandable, based on what was happening in some parts of the country. It had some attractiveness to the regional countries, Pakistan, which supported them, but also the Arab Gulf countries, and even in recent years, Iran, Russia, and they were using all these languages to spread their message: Russian, Urdu, Arabic, English. And the interesting thing was that they were using different content for each of these languages. I mean, when they were speaking in Pashto, they're using a different message. When they were speaking in Urdu, talking to the Pakistanis as their sponsors, their message was different to the Arabs. And the English, a very soft language, saying that, particularly to the Western people, that this is a useless war. Nobody will win this war. They have to leave. You have to put pressure on your governments. And also one thing I think which is very important to mention here is the role of their PR during the Doha peace negotiations. That they did play a very, very important role. They depicted, or should I say, they draw the whole process as a victory process for the Taliban. And really the international forces, the Afghan government, the Western countries, they were defeated in this narrative war there as well. So I should say the Taliban consistently used narratives as a means of furthering their goals, and they were successful. I mean, since the first day until I would argue the day that they entered Kabul. Now, in this last stage, when they captured Kabul, I think they are facing a crisis of narrative. Bilal mentioned interesting points. I think that they are now investing on the idea that we defeated the superpower of the world. We kicked out the infidels and stuff. But the reality is that there are not enough content now for their narrative to draw support from their traditional means of supporters, including people of Afghanistan, some people of Afghanistan, and also countries outside Afghanistan, like Pakistan and the Arab countries. I think they're facing this crisis now, and that's why they're very much trying to control information. The media situation in the country has quite clearly deteriorated since they took power. 60 to 70% of the free media has closed down. Journalists have fled. They're repressing on journalists. They just today we have the news that they have blocked some websites, VOA websites, and also Radio Free Europe websites. So the repression is going on, but there is a clear, I think, confusion among them when it comes to narrative, to what would be, new narrative to further their goals. What should they say, and what should be their literature, and that's why I think that the this competition and fight over the values like the freedom of women, the freedom of expression, human rights, particularly the freedom of women, is an important debate, which has always been part of their narrative, and it creates now differences among themselves. Some groups are, I think, emphasizing that to preserve our unity as a group, which is very important for us. That's what made us successful. That's what brought freedom for us, our unity. If we are losing our main and hardcore values, which are, I would say, they are narratives. All of them are narratives. We're using our hardcore narratives. Then there is going to be a big price for us. And let's just keep these narratives united and go ahead. And the price is that the women are paying for that. So yeah, I think that it's a very important thing.
Well, indeed, and we were talking before we started our session about what the Taliban are mirroring in their attempts to create a new narrative for the Taliban 2.0. And very briefly, because we're up against the clock, you mentioned that you've noticed a similarity between the way the Taliban are trying to frame their 2.0 narrative and the way the Iranian authorities control the narrative that their media are allowed to disseminate. Can you talk just very briefly, just give us an overview of your views of that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, actually. So the Taliban are mostly considered a very Pashtun-dominated group in Afghanistan. You talk to normal people in Afghanistan, the first question you ask them, how would you characterize the Taliban? The first would be obviously extremism, Islamic extremism, and the second would be Pashtun, or something like that. Southern Pashtun, rural Pashtun, or something like that. Which in practice that might not be quite true. But then their relation with the Islamic Republic of Iran, and particularly in the recent years of the American presence in Afghanistan, there was enough evidence that even Iran was competing with the Pakistanis to support the Taliban. So there was a competition going on between the Pakistanis and the main sponsor of the Taliban and Iran. So enough money, they paid money, they just supported, and even they say that Hibbatullah, the current leader, has been closer to Iran than to Pakistan, and that's why the Saudis, the traditional supporter of the Taliban, they're very much keeping away from the Taliban. Recently, they just withdrew their embassy staff. So the interesting thing we noticed as media was that the language, the Persian language the Taliban are using are very organized, and their media campaign in the Persian after they took over power, and even in the recent years, they've been using a very organized language, which even many governments in Afghanistan have been criticized. including the Republicans, that they have a lot of spelling mistakes, they have a lot of language mistakes, they have a lot of grammatical mistakes, and that's not the case with the Taliban when it comes to Persian. While they are, many of them still, they don't have Persian spokesman, they cannot speak. The leader has never spoken Persian. The prime minister has never spoken Persian. Many of their ministers have never spoken Persian.
It's interesting, isn't it? Somebody's paying for good advice there. Thanks a lot, Zia. We'll leave you there if you don't mind, and we'll come back to you when we open up the floor. Thank you. Next, we're going to turn to Solem Ibrahimi. You have a very interesting background that I went through before, and as I said, your research interests are security, strategy and international relations, and I'm very interested to hear from you about the infrastructure and policy coordination of the Taliban in utilising online and social media platforms. We were discussing it earlier. How do the Taliban coordinate their messaging? Do they receive guidance and support from Pakistan's military establishment, especially before August in 2021? How do they organise their hashtags? For instance, it seems to me that a lot of their hashtag organisation is in response rather than being overtly out there. Who are their trolls? There's an army of them. And are they mere passive supporters or organised networks? So I'm going to give the floor to you.
Thank you very much,
yes,
Len, and I'm
you.
grateful to Marika and AISS colleagues for having me here. It's difficult to be talking about a topic that's close to heart, but also to be talking about this as trying to look at things from a fresh perspective. And I'm grateful for this opportunity to try to share my thinking about the topic. And I would like to offer a few ideas, but before I do that, I would like to invite everyone to look at the topic from a perspective of warfare, but also within warfare, the information warfare, and that's related to other concepts like hybrid warfare and fifth generation warfare, which so I see the Taliban digital warfare as part of this broader term that's taking place in the security sector and in the military. So I think the Taliban activity is influenced by that broader trend of whether you call it hybrid warfare or fifth generation warfare, but it falls neatly to me within that framework. To try to look at that, the Taliban activity in that sense, it requires one to look at the information environment, both in Afghanistan but also outside Afghanistan, around Afghanistan, when they were ruling as a government, and then when they became an insurgency, and now when they are ruling again. So I think it's important to see how the information environment in Afghanistan has changed since then. And I would, I probably will repeat some of the things that were already said, so I request forgiveness for that. But I will go back to Afghanistan's history related to our discussion is the contest over narratives and spaces. Traditionally, we have been more of an oral, informal, and mythical spaces. I'm talking about the majority of the country being socialized, the population getting access to information in those kind of spaces. And those spaces have been at the heart of the struggles over Afghanistan in the past, starting from King Amanullah Khan when he pushed the modernization and reform there was a backlash from the conservative society who felt threatened. And then there were obviously the context, the regional context and global context was ripe for interference. And then we saw change. So overall, I would argue that we have this tension over spaces. On the one hand, the state tries to reform, to modernize. On the other hand, you have a counter force hitting back. And I put Taliban as one of those counter forces because they are one of our volatile experiences of our recent history. And they, because they're priests, they're clergy, they already have a leverage and control over space, sacred spaces, the mosques, the madrasa. So they already have an advantage. And I will put another actor closer to the Taliban, and it's because of the past century's development in around Afghanistan. I'm sorry, I'm going away from your question, but I'm coming back to those questions. And I want to set this context before I go to those questions, is the role of Pakistan and the advantages that Pakistan got. Especially during Cold War, Pakistan received a boost in terms of control and influence over the Afghan information environment. With the Cold War, the Soviets lost. So the Soviets sided with the state. The state was modernizing. And then you had the conservative society, the religious society fighting back, the struggle over the space. And then I think that gave an unparalleled advantage primarily to Pakistan, but also Iran against the rest of the region over Afghanistan. And that's important post 9/11 Afghanistan, because Pakistan did not want to give this advantage for its own security, but also for strategic purposes. And that's why it after 2002, it played a double-faced game, both as major non-NATO ally, but also a sponsor of the Taliban. And I think it's important to understand these. Historically, one idea that I would like to add to the discussion is that when Taliban were ruling, there were two kind of pressures on them. Probably there were many other, but two were specific. One was from the types of Osama bin Laden, who had his AK-47 next to him, videotaped, and not shy from camera, willing to publish with Al Jazeera. On the other hand, you had the types of Mullah Omar, and I would say the types of Mullah Omar who were reclusive was influenced by a Pakistani desire for control and stability, and Osama bin Laden kind of persona was at the end of it. So those two pressures were being felt within the Taliban. And I think the Osama bin Laden type was more attractive even before 9/11 happened. So we had this seedlings of the digital mullahs even back from that time. And once they were pushed out of Afghanistan, the Taliban, in Pakistan, after the initial stage of shock, and most of the leaders accounted this, the Taliban leaders, that they were given a choice. Detention, being handed over to the Americans, or returning as an insurgency to Afghanistan. And that moment when the Taliban could be brought in as a political entity into the fold was lost, because they were not included in the Bonn conference. So they fell back into those regions of the Pakistan that they already had connections because of the Soviet era, but also because of education, training, and sharing common learning spaces. And they started at the initial stage, they started from reclaiming this lost space in Afghanistan, the lost environment. So they tried to work the same networks of mullahs, madrasas, and mosques, and the military commanders. So in the initial stage, it was trying to use the Pakistani-based madrasas back to Afghanistan. And that's how most of the leaders had jobs, day jobs, I would say, including Habatullah as a teacher or the custodian of a madrasa or a mosque. So those were the day jobs, and those centers and schools were used to launch again into Afghanistan. After 2005, 2006, what the Taliban suffered a number of setbacks because the way they were conducting warfare on the battlefield in the information space was not adequate to compete with the US-led campaign in Afghanistan, both the war campaign but also the information campaign. They were up against a modern information operation. The government in Afghanistan was also picking up activity. Elections were being campaigned. There was a lot of jargon. So a lot of information was being pushed to. So that's when I think they realized, and I think there was another factor. Yeah.
So digital mullah, they're coming to get us. Yeah.
There was another factor as well. The influences of groups like Al Qaeda, but also the success of Al Qaeda in Iraq had also an influence over what was happening in Afghanistan. In addition to the strategic inputs from Pakistan, mainly to the support of the Taliban. And I think that's when they started becoming more active on the digital front. They realized that the traditional way of fighting doesn't work. There are a number of other timelines that are important. I think the information campaign was concurrent with the Taliban embracing other technology like the IEDs. And I think they used those, as was noted in the concept paper for the CBN, very effectively in support of each other. The terror campaign in action. The other factor was the expansion of telecommunication in Afghanistan and access of more Afghans to internet and digital media, and moving away from the traditional radio and other medium of information sharing. There are some people who think that 2009, 2010 may be a good time to see that the Taliban transformed from the digital. And the argument is that it was in response to the surge. But I think it probably began earlier, around 2005, 2006, because of those things that were already in play. In later years, probably I will come back to this in questions, because we probably will be running out of time. I spoke a little bit about the Pakistani aspect and their support and their motivations for why they are doing it. I can come back to the Pakistani undercurrents and how that impacts Taliban's digital activity even today, with very links that could be observed even from the open source, from the social media, how Pakistani politics are being brought into the Afghan environment, information environment, and how different segments within the Taliban take sides between PTI, former government, and the new PDM, the new government there in Pakistan, and how those small political tensions play out in Afghanistan from an information space. One thing that I would like to add, that the perceptions in Pakistan have been built over the years historically, but the Cold War era and the War on Terror, there is a deeper undercurrent of colonial legacy in the Pakistani understanding of Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is seen as a warlike, is projected as a mujahid nation, and people who are good at fighting, but that's it. And I think that even leads them sometimes to see Afghans in a very different racial profiling compared to the rest of the world. It serves them very well, but I think it's counterproductive. Unfortunately for the rest of the world, sometimes they fall into that narrative, and that includes people like President Biden buying that kind of a narrative, that Afghans are a hopeless cause, if I may say. I will switch to the American and Western narratives, and then I will stop there. I think the asymmetries were there, they were known, but I think when the Americans and their allies started looking at Afghanistan, the experience of the first Iraq was fresh, and there was this idea that revolution military affairs gives you advantage, especially the Americans, advantage to be quick, fast, and that's it. With Saddam, it was like that. The information revolution really helped the American military. But in the Afghan case, what was overlooked, that there is another asymmetry, and that asymmetry is that with the social media, the cheaper decentralized cells and networks could probably have an advantage over you, especially if they have access to local networks and have an advantage of information against you. I think that assumption proved very costly in later years. I would probably come back to some other debates about Iranian influence and how the environment is shaping right now. So I will stop there.
Well,
I'm sorry if I'm going
no,
over time.
not at all. But I'm very interested in you noting the coincidence of timing with the surge. Is that it was also the time when the Americans started putting an awful lot of money into the development of Afghanistan's free media between, I think, 2010 and 2015, $1 billion went in. And so suddenly there was an explosion of outlets. Do you think that this also was useful for the time? You know, the more outlets that there are, the more demand there is for information. And this was all over the country. Do you see them as having been clever in the way that maybe they used this explosion of media and huge demand for information?
Yeah, I agree. I think they took advantage of that very effectively. And as you shared your experience, before they took over Kabul, the areas that the Taliban were controlling or were highly contesting, in those areas the Taliban exercised a similar control system. And I think it's an extension of what the Pakistanis are doing on the other side of the Durand line. Controlled information, controlled, restricted information environment where their word gets distributed. Any other alternative narratives are blocked. Any dissent is then dealt with extreme force. So I think you're right. But I mean, Al-Imara, for instance, the website was, I think, launched in 2005. And Zabiullah Mujahid's account, I don't recall the current one, which has not, the initial one was taken down, but whatever the current one is there for some time, and it's a long time. So they had these studios on the other side of the Duran line, production studios. But I would agree that they used local media through coercion, through, for instance, I would add one other thing that probably will not go easy with our journalist colleagues, is the access. Some journalists were given access on the condition that they provide favorable narratives or favorable reporting. Others would not, and I think that's still the case. So those who present Project Taliban in a very favorable fashion, they get to have access. Those who don't obviously have issues. I will come back to the narrative tension if there was time. I would like to speak about what I see the tension between victory narrative and Taliban 2 narrative. And this is my observation. It doesn't have a lot of research, scientific research, but I would share that if needed later.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think we'll open up to questions. How do we want to do that, Marika? Are we going to the screen? Are we going to the room?
Shall we first go to the screen since we often ignore the screen?
Do we have any questions online? Not just yet. Raise of hands. Who wants to ask a question in the room? There we go. Gentleman at the back there.
Second speaker. When you were speaking, you mentioned about narrative creation, and then I think you mentioned that from 2010, you spoke about that's after the Russian war, after the Russian intervention. You spoke about they reinventing themselves on their narrative creation. Now, now that they are in power, you spoke about they find it very difficult to create content for their for communication. Now, summing these three stages together, are we saying if you look at the current digital connectivity of the Taliban, are we saying they have some centralized command where they create some kind of collective action or collective narrative where people can throw in on somebody who is speaking out of the ordinary?
It's a really good question. Yeah, where does it all come from, basically? Yeah.
So what I said was the three phases of the Taliban narrative. They're during 1990s, and then post 9/11, and now since 15th August 2021, when they returned back to Kabul. Taliban, from what I know, is they have a centralized system in the sense that they have an emir at the top, and he's in charge of pretty much everything. But operationally, one thing that many scholars have, I think, agreed is that they've been polycentric. They've had many centers of power. Right now, they are actually divided into three. During their resistance against the Western invasion of Afghanistan, or Western presence in Afghanistan, so they had the Quetta Shura, which was in Pakistan, and then they had the Peshawar Shura, also in Pakistan, in two important cities, and they had the Haqqani network, which was the Miran Shah Shura, they used to call it, which was also in Pakistan, and then in recent years, they had the Mashhad Shura, which was in Iran. So these were the four important power centers that were making decisions for the Taliban. And mostly their narratives were built in Pakistan. They were very much, it's almost accepted everybody that it was the ISI of Pakistan who was making the narrative, built on an experience that they had during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. When the Soviets were in Afghanistan, the Pakistanis and particularly their intelligence service was the main institution which was in relation with the Afghan Mujahideen. They trained them. The Western and the Gulf states were channeling their finances through the ISI, and they were deciding which group of Mujahideen should receive how much money, and they always had their favorable groups. And that was the experience that the Taliban narrative was built. The Taliban came from the Pakistani madrasas, they're foot soldiers. I mean, I know there might be a lot of counter-argument about this, but there is enough evidence that this is what is happening. Millions of Afghan immigrants in Pakistan, and then they were studying in the madrasas, and then when the Taliban decided to be created in Kandahar in 1994, their foot soldiers were supplied from these madrasas, and narratives was supplied from Pakistan. But I mean that doesn't mean that it doesn't have roots in Afghanistan. It means that the Pakistanis know the Afghan society very well, and they have a very I mean they talk. I mean their policymakers are saying that we've always been best knowing Afghanistan better than many Afghans themselves and the Westerners. So this is an argument that's been going on. So I would say, yeah, the Pakistanis mostly.
Thanks. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Great. I'd like to throw it to Bilal as well. Do you see this, as mentioned, this disparate messaging as being a problem for the Taliban to project a cohesive, united front?
I apologize if you hear my daughter, crying. That's just my 18-month-old daughter, Sola. Are you there with me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I think I want to go back a little bit, 2005 and 6, Lynn, when I was working with the BBC as a producer reporter. I remember doing a story on how the Taliban in Khost province, well, mainly the Afghanis, were inflicting a lot of pain and suffering on the Americans and the Afghan soldiers by sort of bringing, the IEDs into the battlefield, right? And I remember the videos that were being produced by As-Sahab, which was Al-Qaeda's media wing, was to me the first sort of transformation of Taliban, in that sort of propaganda sphere. And we know that Bin Laden was personally interested in media, and we personally sort of, injected media into its sort of main, pillar of strategies. And we know he was conducting a lot of interviews and so on and so forth. So even today, some very critical counterterrorism officials, even from the Republic, as well as Westerners, tell you that it is quite possible that Al-Qaeda is producing videos out of GDI Studios, which is the Taliban's intelligence service, but previously it was NDS, which was CIA's sort of shining star. And Mr. Ibrahimi could probably speak about that, our friend, because he would know more about that topic. But, the peace of mind that Al-Qaeda and other transnational jihadi groups have, and sort of help that they are giving to Taliban, coming from the east, from Kunar, following the Islamic State and other militant groups, sometimes, you can see that the Taliban are copy and paste a combination of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State sort of media strategy, right? But then the Taliban have a social media General Mubin and many of these guys, right, who are, in my view, problematic for the Taliban because they're very popular among Afghans, even non-Afghans, for some small reasons now and then. And recently, this guy basically came out and criticized a failed kidnapping of an Afghan trader in which 2 leading Taliban commanders were involved, and they were shot dead. Not very far from where actually I used to live in Khalifatullah in Kabul. And you would remember that he was summoned Kandahar. And a huge pressure was built even by the Taliban social media apparatus. Where is this guy? Is he safe, right? So we know that the Taliban are very nervous, about anyone who raises the question of girls' education or high crime rate or the involvement of Taliban in kidnappings, which now there's an overwhelming, amount of evidence given by the Taliban to us by people like General Mubin. So that I thought was very interesting. And as I think my colleague and old friend Zia Sharia said, they're running out of narratives. I mean, there's an interesting guy working for Sirajuddin Haqqani. His name is Jalal. And you have to just basically go and follow his Twitter. He's the right-hand man to Sirajuddin Haqqani. And in some ways, he makes the Republic officials look good. The silly Republic officials who would wake up in the morning and cut one ribbon like 10 times. That's how the Republic was deceiving Afghans for a good period of 3-4 years. And the Talibs are sort of not doing a bad job there. The other issue is that I noticed that there are WhatsApp groups, and I know this for a fact that there are WhatsApp groups that they have where their only job is to just monitor screenshots. So what Len O'Donnell tweets or what Zia tweets or many of our other colleagues tweet. And if there is something that makes the Taliban look bad for a variety of reasons, if someone is inside the country, then they simply call them and warn them. Otherwise, they try to reach out to people. They have reached out to me on a number of occasions. So I wanted to end it there. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, indeed. Thanks, Bilal. This lady here, you've got a question.
My name is Mitra. I'm Afghan witness. Just to say that my colleagues are watching and online, and they're just sending me some questions. I think I would ask it from Bilal. And the question is, they're asking about what could be the 3 key messaging or narratives of the Taliban that they utilize now. Now that you said that the Taliban are running out of narratives, so what are left for them?
Did you hear that, Bilal? A question for you.
I did, and unfortunately, I'm being put on the spot for all the tough questions. But let me put it this way. We remember the fist fight inside the presidential palace between the Haqqanis and Southerners, where I think, quite frankly, they threw even tea glasses at each other. And the tension sort of started to explode very publicly, right? Because one Taliban official mistakenly sent a WhatsApp message to someone, an audio message, which sort of went like a bullet, where the senior Taliban official in the defense ministry, we know his name, and voice, we confirmed it, he said, they won't fight. And the situation got sort of out of control because General Faiz Hamid flew into Kabul, the notorious ISI chief at the time, to basically bring some sort of peace, right? And to be honest with you, in the weeks that followed and the months and until today, you can see an overwhelming number of people close to Barada and the Haqqanis, putting a fake show on Twitter saying we have no problem between each other. To the point where Anas Haqqani, the younger brother of Sirajuddin, and Mullah both were forced to record a video, you guys will remember that, where they denied that publicly, number one. Number two, I think it was just less than 24 hours ago, someone's, heard a rumor saying that, Turkey is taking, I think, thousands of Afghans to go and help with the earthquake. The next thing you know, a couple thousand people from all around Kabul rushed to it, right? And the rumor that spread very quickly was that, well, there may have been a bigger problem, right? That some people interpret differently. And the Taliban to the airport, including the social media John Mubin and many others, first they used cards, which would correlate what the police and the Republic would do to disperse protesters or like angry crowd and something like that. And now the narrative, has been constantly for weeks now that look, there's no coup, there's no power struggle, no problem, everything's fine, Afghanistan is good, I think now it is on the Taliban. They are forced out of the situation to basically come and convince not only the Afghan people but their own. And those are the cracks that we're looking at. The cracks are becoming bigger. The Taliban are simply not sustainable. They know that. And shamelessly, I mean, not my place to say this, but it's shameless to actually see some of our friends in the West, continue to basically promote the Taliban still as the saviors and the most sort of suitable solution. We're not saying that you should choose the Republic or the Taliban. As I said, the Afghan people are victims of that. But you should not shy away from holding the Taliban accountable, right? Less than 24 hours ago, a young doctor from Shakada district was taken from his house. For 3 days he went missing at a Taliban jail, and then his dead body was returned. And you don't see anyone talk about that. You don't see that on the front page of the New York Times. You don't see that in the British media, right? You don't see our friends, who followed Afghanistan write about that, right? So I think those are sort of the areas, without me being able to give you 3 reasons, I think there are 300 reasons. But keep an eye for cracks within the Taliban leadership, file and rank, and I think you can probably find your answer.
Yeah, I think what you're saying really is united front, move along, nothing to see here, everything in Afghanistan is fine, and making sure that bad news doesn't get out. Yeah. Have you got more questions from your colleagues? Just
can I add one?
Yes, please do.
The narrative they're very much trying to keep is obviously security. That they've always played it as their winning card, and still they're playing on that we've secured the country's under our control. You can travel all around, and you can see these YouTube journalists, foreigners even, that they're now traveling across different parts of the country, shooting videos and saying that look, it's secure and stuff like that, which kind of give the feeling that the Taliban are controlling these, or somebody is controlling this narrative. So that's why they're very much kind of attentive about security, and also then the implementation of Sharia law, their version of Sharia, and that's why they've been different from the last time the Taliban was in power. They haven't been as strict in implementing Sharia as they used to be in the past, but they've just recently started implementing these cutting hands and the other Islamic rules, which is showing that they're worried about their unity. And it's very important for them if they lose the Islamic legitimacy, because there are many other groups in Afghanistan who are fighting for the Islamic legitimacy. And now that the TTP, the Taliban, Pakistani Taliban, which is emerging as a really big threat to the Pakistanis, and the Pakistanis are very unhappy with the Taliban. It could go to a level that the Pakistanis might at some point decide to attack the Afghan Taliban if the situation goes on like this. So the leadership of Taliban are very aware of this thing, that all these sort of religious groups, if we are losing the Islamic legitimacy, who is going to control the situation?
So you had a question?
A comment and then followed by a question. We heard a very rounded narrative from Bilal. Thank you starting about the narrative from 1990s and all the other dimensions from studying. But I wanted to start with what in the 1990s Zia said, that they used the two-term, their intervention, the shadow of the soul, and in Persian, or basically means evil and corruption. And their corruption is moral corruption. So not basically the concept of corruption that we have in the economy or politics. So I wanted to draw your attention to a very classical book that Barbara Bittkov has written on the Ubandi movement in the subcontinent, and that's the most authoritative book that is there in academia, and it's in 1984. There she says, rightly says, that there are a lot of revivalist movements in Islam, 1400 years of Islam, and she generalizes four characteristics for each revivalist movement. And for her, the most important characteristic of this revivalist movement is their being bothered with the moral corruption of the society. And once morally the society is corrupt, something has to be done. The second characteristic is that they want to do something about it, and they want to go back to the origins of Islam, that is the pure Sharia. And then they think that if we go back to the pure Sharia, then the moral corruption will be remedied. So, of course, fourthly, they will always have a charismatic leader who is very austere, very, someone who is basically the embodiment of implementation of Sharia on his own, way of living. So when you look at the Taliban emergence in 1994, they have all these four characteristics. I would wonder, as someone who studies the region, subcontinent, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, how come a revivalist movement is emerging out of the blue, and it is basically the war in the 1990s in Afghanistan, and mostly this conflict in Afghanistan is unfortunately, summarized by the expert as internal, basically as civil war, which was not. It was another geopolitical war that was fought in Afghanistan between different regional countries, including Pakistan. So, out of the blue, this movement comes in with this narrative. It is deep roots in Islam and deep roots in revivalist movements. So, the question to you is that, you divided their narrative into several sections. Initially in 1990, they were fighting against their fellow Muslims who had brought down the Soviet Union, and how they could, of course, they couldn't use this issue of, kufr, that it was in the second stage from 2001 onward that they were using. At that time, it was too difficult for them to argue, to fight against a Muslim regime, but they used this terminology of corruption, and that's moral corruption. So, would you comment on that? Do you see that continuation of the moral purity of the society still in the leader and the movement or not? Thank you. Sorry, it was too long.
Sorry. You answered it actually as well. But I think, the Taliban's interpretation of Islam is obviously a very exclusive interpretation, always characterized in the sense that they have it, and obviously they linked it to the Deobandi school of Islam, which is a kind of Hanafi subcontinent Islam, but it's very exclusive as well. The restriction of women education and the restrictions that they're imposing on women. Recently we had all schools of Islam, all countries, Islamic countries, who were saying that this is not part of Islam. And what you're doing is that we do not know where you get this interpretation. We know that in 1990s, as you said, the civil war, I mean, the so-called civil war, but obviously the regional countries, including Pakistan, were involved. It had an ethnic dimension to it as well. There were these Mujahideen groups who came to Kabul, representing different ethnic groups in Afghanistan, mostly the four important ethnic groups, which are the Tajiks, Pashtuns, Hazaras, and Uzbeks in Afghanistan. And historically, there is an argument that this period had challenged the long-term domination of Pashtuns for centuries. So this was a period that non-Pashtuns were in power in Kabul. And this was not something that Pakistanis were happy about. Neither were some of the Pashtun nationalists, and the majority of the Pashtuns possibly. Apart from the destructive civil war which was going on, the government of Burhanuddin Rabbani was not able to enforce rule of law across the country, so fighting was inside the capital, all over the country. But when it comes to philosophical discussion, I should say, there was a deep disillusionment among the Pashtuns that thought that their years of rulership has gone, and they did not have a clear picture where the country is going. Traditionally, they had the power, and they had good relationship, obviously, with the Pakistanis. Pakistanis were not happy with the government in Kabul. Things were really in disarray, and this was the best opportunity for Pakistanis and for some Pashtun leaders, including in the south, to challenge the government in Kabul, to use religion, their own interpretation of Islam. And they succeeded, because that's how it was supposed to be, because the situation was really bad. Nobody was happy. The international community was very worried about the situation in Afghanistan. The US was out of there. And I kind of see this kind of similarity with 2001 as well, when the Americans invaded Afghanistan. There was again an ethnic element to the war. The non-Pashtuns came back to power, most of them, apart from Mr. Karzai, who was as the leader of the country. The majority of the government was formulated by the non-Pashtuns, and this was also part of the narrative that the Taliban played on. The Northern Alliance, the Panjshiris, the Tajiks, the Shias, the Hazaras. So these are part of the Taliban. These were part of the Taliban narrative, although they were very careful in the second round. They were mostly investing on jihad, on invasion, Western invasion, kuffar, and these things. Very careful with the factional things. But the Pakistanis, I think, realized very soon that there is again another opportunity to support the Taliban, and they could represent the disillusionment of the Pashtuns, rural Pashtuns particularly.
Katrina.
Thank you very much. I think, and I have this unpopular idea, that there was a moment, perhaps it was a brief moment, that the Taliban could have been brought into the fold. Pakistan could be denied leverage over that. And I think that was lost. We had, in the Bonn construct, we had parties which had a similar, if not very different, background to the Taliban. We had parties which had common past with Pakistan. They were based in Pakistan. They were involved in the jihad. So they were militaristic organizations. But I think what the bond process did was give them the opportunity to, if not wholly, but partly transform from from purely military organizations to political entities. And I think they were successful. Some of them were more successful and some were less. The Taliban didn't have that opportunity to transform from a purely militaristic organization to a political one. And I think what the Americans did was, with the Doha deal, it was actually a miscalculation on this part specifically. If they were really intent on having a solution for Afghanistan, a political solution that included the Taliban, but others as well, they didn't give it enough time so the Taliban could be transformed into a political entity. One aspect was timing, another aspect was when President Trump announced the South Asia strategy, it included both military pressure but also diplomatic pressure on Pakistan to convince the Taliban to start that transformation, which was short-lived. There were other pressures on the decision makers in the US, especially President Trump, who shifted track and just went. They gave priority to tactical strategy, and the South Asia strategy, which with time could have brought some results, was given a very short leg. And I would echo what was said earlier. It's locally in Afghanistan, in each region, you may have these ethnic dynamics, but any ethnicity within Afghanistan is powerless against global and regional geopolitical shifts and priorities, but also as much power as any ethnic group could exercise, it's very limited to the area of their control and influence. Beyond those areas, it is very difficult for them to sustain control and influence. So it's much more to do with trends and shifts outside Afghanistan than within Afghanistan. And I think it was back then the Americans not wanting to bring the Taliban back to the fold, not the Afghans, if I can remember very well. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think if there are no more questions, we'll close it there. Leave it to me to say thank you to Suleiman, Zia, and to you, Bilal, for getting up so early in Canada to join us. And
thank you, Lynn. I don't want to leave you thinking that I never wake up early.
You're the one who said 9 a.m. was early.
That's probably for consumption, but thank you.
Thank you for joining us. And thank you to everyone in the room too. I hope it's been an interesting and informative discussion for you, and we will cede the space to the next panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we deserve some applause. I think so. Yeah.
There's coffee and tea and some snacks outside for that half an hour.